Hello, my friends. I'm Mrs. Surette, and I just wanted to go ahead and make a quick recording of what we did today in class. I'm sorry I didn't, have everything all set up, and they're still working on the jigsaw recorder, so I'll be working on this, and hopefully I'll be getting this out for you guys a little better than tomorrow. So today we had a little bit of introduction as well as just psychology, talking about psychology research. Psychology is a science. It's a social science, which is why it's part of social studies, which is why I'm a social studies elective. So one of the first things we did was we talked about the schedule, and most people seem to have gotten it down. But just in case you're not sure when your class meets, my psychology classes are all based in the afternoons, so you'll notice I don't have periods 1 through 4. But you can look, for example, if you're my fifth period, you would have Monday, Tuesday, and Friday at 12:30 to 1:15. But then Wednesdays, we would meet at 10:55 to 12:10, meaning we do not meet on Thursdays, but don't cry. I'll be back Friday. So just make sure you take a look at that. And if you have any questions on the schedule, let me know. But there should be an announcement on the Canvas module page that you can see also that tells you a little bit about it. And of course, it's also on your Canvas calendar. All right, so we discussed today instructions because, like I said, psychology is a science. And when you're doing experiments or research, there are instructions. So we talked about things we need we need instructions for in order to be able to do it. For example, we talked about cooking or baking, learning an instrument, building something like this lovely Hogwarts castle, which would not look good for me unless I had instructions, any number of things. And it can just basically things you're unfamiliar with or not comfortable with, you'd probably want some instructions to get you started. And I was talking about whether it's good to know all of the instructions at once or if you should go step by step. And the agreement for a lot of my students was that step by step is the best, being able to have that one instruction at a time, go through it, and go to the next. But some of us talked about how it's nice to have all the instructions, especially if they're written, so you can scan through them and kind of understand where you are in the process. But then you're going to go back to the step by step. So for some of us, we kind of look at the whole picture before we look at the details. Other people just want to focus on that one detail at a time to keep from being overwhelmed or stressed. And last but not least, I talked about consistency. Do you want those instructions to be consistent each time? A lot of people agreed that they would, but some people wanted variety. So they were hoping for some kind of variations that might lead them to be able to do different things. But the reason I brought this up is because in research, any kind of research, including psychological, we need to know the scientific method. And the scientific method, you might be thinking, whoa, when did this become science class? Well, like I told you, it's a social science. It has certain steps, and we agreed you really can't skip around, which was good because Professor Snape does not want us to skip around at all, obviously. He wants us to go through the scientific method in order. So we started by discussing what each of these first pieces are. Observation. What kind of problem or situation are you seeing? What's going on? What, interests you or intrigues you and makes you want to learn a little more? Then we talked about the research, which is really important. A lot of people kind of skip this step or they think they should. But the truth is there's so much out there, and it's possible someone's already done some experimentation on this, and you may want to direct your experimentation or your thoughts in a different manner. And last but not least, a hypothesis. Now that you've got this education, what do you think is going to be the result of an experiment on this topic? Now then notice I put think in very large letters. That's because I want you to remember that your hypothesis, it is based on educated research, but it's a guess. It could be right, it could be wrong. And you can't sit down and decide this is right and this is the way it is. You have to go through the research itself in order to know what's going to happen next. So a few things I wanted to point out to my friends. One is, where are we going to find these experimental subjects? And it was funny because some of my students said, oh, me, I'll be your guinea pig. And some students said, no, thank you. I'm not interested in being experimented on. And so that's a really important consideration as a researcher. Who or what are we going to include if we're doing animal research, for example? So the first thing we have to consider is, what is our population? What is the whole group that we have to pull from? So for example, imagining I am a professor at Hogwarts, perhaps my population is the students at Hogwarts, right? But not everybody's going to want to participate, and not everybody can because maybe not everybody has the skills or the information I need. So what I have to do from that population is to pull the select group that I'll actually use, which is my sample. So perhaps I'm doing an experiment about a particular type of defense against a play in Quidditch. Well, if a student doesn't have Quidditch experience, they're not necessarily going to be very helpful to me because their lack of experience could actually be a confounding variable. And I'll talk about that in a moment. So I'm going to focus specifically on Hogwarts students who play Quidditch. That's who I would be looking at if that was my experiment. Now here's the thing about research. It is really awesome to do, but sometimes there's pitfalls that people don't pay attention to, and it can cause a lot of problems. For example, let's imagine that I ask my students, or I ask people, who has more stress, teenagers or adults? And in fact, I asked my students this. I said green check if it's teenagers, red X if it's adults. And 3 of my 4 classes agreed that teenagers had more stress than adults. Okay? Now, something to consider there. I only asked my students who are teenagers their opinion. So how does that affect the results? Well, as one student pointed out, she doesn't have the life experience of an adult, so she doesn't know what it is to be an adult. She can only look at where she is now, and therefore she thinks being a teenager would be more stressful. Also, of course, teenagers are probably more likely to say teenagers because in a way, you kind of assume that you are doing more or have more stress than others. So the first thing we have to consider when we're doing research is we want to beware of bias. If we've already got this opinion or this idea of where we want our research to go or the answer to go, we have to be really careful that we don't steer our research where we don't want it to be, or we don't try to force the results that we get into the ideas that we already have. And a great example was Harry during the Sorting Hat, where he's telling it, please not Slytherin, please not Slytherin. He already had this bias against Slytherin before he was even sorted or put into the appropriate house. The other thing to consider is I only asked the students who came to my class. So that's about a little over 50% came to each of my classes. So if I'm telling you that 3 out of my 4 classes said teens have more stress, and I only asked teenagers, could I generalize that 75% of teenagers think they have more stress than adults? Well, I really don't have a very large sample size. And like I said, before I even did this experiment, honestly, I would have guessed 100% of teenagers would have said that. But surprisingly, no, I had a class that didn't agree. So I needed to be open to what the research told me. And then I need to make sure that I have enough people to be able to generalize. And Hermione is not pleased because I did not have enough people. Sorry, Hermione. So then we talked about variables, the types of variables, the variables, the independent variable, the dependent variable, and the confounding variable. Now, the independent variable is the variable changed by the experimenter. It's the one manipulated or set up by the experimenter in such a way as to cause an effect on the next part, which is the dependent variable. The dependent variable depends on the change or the setup of the independent variable. So it's going to show the effect of what is caused by the independent variable. Okay, so the independent variable is the one that if I'm doing the research, I'm actually going to manipulate or change it. That's the one I'm going to control. And then the people in my experiment, whatever their results are the dependent variable because I've made that change on them. The confounding variable, now this is one a lot of my students had not heard of, but this is actually, sometimes when you do an experiment, something gets in the way of the answer, like something affects the answers or the outcome, and it wouldn't have normally happened except for this confounding variable. So this is a variable that's not accounted for in the experiment, but it could affect it. So let's see if you've got this. So the first thing I did is I asked my students to read a situation, or actually I read it to them, but now I have it in here, and tell me if they thought it was the independent variable, the dependent variable, or the confounding variable. So let me show you. Let's imagine that we have a preschool teacher named Sarah who wanted to see which of two new toys, a puzzle or a block set, her preschool class enjoyed playing with most. She observed how often each toy was played with every day for 1 week and recorded the total number of minutes per day each toy was used. So imagine that she's got these two tables. They're very similar tables. They have similar access. She puts these toys out and she's looking to record the amount of time that the toys were used. So the question is, which variable would the choice of toys be? Now think about it. Sarah is the experimenter. She's manipulating the choice of toys by setting them out where the kids can reach them and then giving them the time. So the correct answer would be the independent variable, right? All right, let's try the next one. Audrey wanted to know if college students majoring in history were more creative than students majoring in psychology. She selected 100 history majors and 100 psychology majors to take a test designed to measure creativity. So the question is, which variable would the test measurements be? So let's think about it. What is Audrey manipulating or changing? Is she manipulating the type of major that they have or the test? Well, she's manipulating the type of major that they have, so it's not the independent variable. And she plans on measuring their test measurement or measuring their creativity, which means it's not a confounding variable, so the only option left is the dependent variable. All right, last try. Then we have Nikki. Nikki wanted to know if her students' critical thinking ability related to how much reading the students did in their free time. She had 100 of her students record how much time they spent reading outside of school for 1 month and then had them complete a critical thinking test. During the test, there was a fire drill. Not all of the students got to finish their test. Last question, which variable would the fire drill be? All right, well, Nikki is the experimenter. Did she change or manipulate the fire drill? To be honest with you, I don't see anything in here that indicates the fire drill was a part of it. Okay, is the fire drill was that an effect of the change to her independent variable? No, not really. So the only thing left, right, is that she didn't anticipate this happening, but it did affect her experiment, so it has to be a confounding variable. All right. So you are being challenged to a knowledge duel by Draco Malfoy. So let's see if we can outduel him. Let's imagine I'm going to do an experiment with GCA students who take psychology. What is my population and what is my sample? Well, the population is the large group of people that I can select from. What would that be here? That would be the students at GCA, right? They would be my population. So my sample would have to be the students in psychology. Here's the next part. This experiment will involve asking students to study at different times of day. All students will take the same test and I will compare their scores. So the question is, what is the independent variable and what is the dependent variable? Well, what am I manipulating? What am I changing? I'm the experimenter. Am I manipulating the times of day that they're studying or their test scores? Well, I'm asking them to study at different times, so I'm manipulating the different times, which means the independent variable is the different times of day, and the dependent variable is their scores. And last but not least, during the experiment, Canvas stopped working. I know, what a shock. And no students were able to access the test. What do we call that? That other variable, confounding. Yes, that's right. So we finished out our class. I thanked everyone for attending. I hope that you found this useful and helpful. We will talk more about different variables in research. And next class, we'll talk about qualitative research. So I look forward to getting your opinions because I need to get some information from you guys. But at this point, Dobby is a free elf, so you may head off. And thank you so much for watching this recording.